What's up, Wizards? It's Dev and Ziggy from Mtg. We like that magic stuff, and today I got a hole in my shirt over there. I want to go ahead and address that so that you don't spend the whole video like, what's going on with Dev's shirt? I got a hole in it, but I really like this shirt, so I'm going to wear it. I don't care. And second of all, and probably more importantly, we're going to do a fun little video today. It's one of my favorite kind of videos to do, and it's usually like really popular. I have no idea why. It's kind of a silly video, and I always spend the first 2 minutes justifying its existence. But I guess you clicked on it, you're here. That's a good reason for it to exist. But in case you don't know exactly what I'm on about here, we're going to talk about 10 cards that I want to see in Zendikar Rising, but specifically and importantly, not 10 reprints I'd like to see, or else I would have named the video that. No, instead we're going to talk about 10 original cards of mine own creation that I'd like to see in Zendikar Rising in some form or another. Now, here comes that explanation bit that I was talking about, because I know this is kind of a silly video concept, but it's a lot of fun. A lot of people seem to like it. You can go in the comment section and tell me what cards you'd most like to see. You know, we can kind of push creative design in some ways. And more importantly, I think most importantly, we can analyze what we actually expect out of this set, how to revisit old mechanics, or at least hit on old mechanics in a new way, or how to create cards that, say, defend against some of the cards we know are going to be powerful post-rotation. How do you defend against adventures? How do you create cards that are good against, say, Uro, for instance? There's a lot of reasons to want to do a video like this, and some of them are actually good reasons. But for the most part, this is just a super fun video that I get to do every now and again, and I hope that you also have fun with it. So let's go ahead and get into it. These are 10 cards that I'd like to see in Zendikar Rising. And we're back already, and I hope you don't mind if I just kind of go ahead and jump into talking about cards, because I couldn't think of a better way to segue into talking about cards than to simply just like do it. So let's go. I hope you're ready. First of all, first card we're going to talk about is like fairly simple. I don't want to push things in terms of like design, or for that matter, flavor, like what I expect from this set in terms of themes or characters or the overall Zendikar-ness of it just yet. We'll get into those cards a little bit later in the video, but I wanted to start fairly simple here and talk about a card that I think will give a little help to one of my favorite archetypes right now, and forever for that matter, and that's White Weenie. Now, of course, in the past we had Savannah Lions, an iconic creature in Magic lore, and for a long time the only 1-mana 2/1 available to anyone that wanted to play aggro. But of course, as time went by, we got a Samaru Hound of Khanda, a 1-mana 2/2. Oh, but it's legendary. You got to pay legendary tax for that extra point of toughness. And as the years went by, we've seen pushed 1-mana 2/1 after pushed 1-mana 2/1 with upsides like Venerable Knight, which we not only have in the format now, but won't rotate. But I want more than one 1-mana creature with a juiced power toughness in the next format if we're going to make mono white work. And honestly, I think we can push that power toughness even farther than 2/2. So ladies and gentlemen, the first card of the video, finally, this guy's going to shut up and show us a thing. Here's Feral Direhound, a 1-mana 3/3 with 2 relevant creature types, both wolf and dog, but what I consider to be a massive downside. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you tap target creature you control. This means a few things. Flavor-wise, this is supposed to represent that this thing is way too wild and way too feral to actually handle, so you have to have somebody to handle it, and that preoccupies them from attacking. They don't get to attack that turn because they're too busy making sure that this thing doesn't get out of hand. Of course, if you don't have any other creatures, that taps down the Direhound, because again, this is too wild to handle. So if you have other creatures out, this becomes much better, but of course you don't get to attack with them. The upside is that if you play this on turn 1 and then play a creature on turn 2, well, that creature's got summoning sickness anyway, so you kind of don't mind that you don't get to attack with that guy. You just tap it down during your combat step, swing in with your 3/3. But that will quickly, I imagine, get unmanageable and slow you down a little bit. Of course, the upside is that you got a 1-mana 3/3 out of the deal. So I think this is reasonably balanced, and again, helps out more than just White Weenie. This will help out Wolves decks and Historic if you want to do that, and more importantly, Dogs decks and Standard, because it's on color with those decks. And those decks need another good, strong 1-drop if they're going to be as aggro as they want to be. But let's say you think that card's a little bit busted, or conversely, maybe that card's not enough for you in terms of 1-drop dogs that maybe you'd like to play. Well, I took another swing at it. I've got another 1-drop dog for you, and this one actually I think is a little bit better. Like I said before, you can make 1-mana 2/1s and push them to actually have upside in this day and age. And I wanted to use this entry in the list to start responding to some of the things that I think we're going to have to sort of nerf in this next format, right? How do we, one of those questions from the beginning of the video, how do we create cards that significantly nerf strategies that we know are going to be powerful enough to where new cards can compete? Well, here is a take on Jackal Pup that I think you'll really like. Here is Destructive Jackal, just 1 red mana for a 2/1 dog. But in this case, it's the text box and not the PT ratio that matters the most. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under a player's control, if it's not the first land that entered the battlefield under their control that turn, that player then has to sacrifice a land. Now, this is a symmetrical effect, so you can't play it in your ramp decks, but it does nerf a lot of the ramp strategies we'll probably see in this next format, from Cultivate to Uro to Migration Path, even possibly. Like, any of these ramp cards that allow your opponent to put extra lands into play are going to be pretty null and void, and very early in the game too. You can get this down on turn 1 and really cause some pain to anyone trying to put extra lands on the battlefield. I think that a card like this can keep aggro, you know, in the forefront, or at least in the conversation, while also nerfing those ramp strategies that people are really starting to grow tired of. But no matter how much I like that last card, let's go ahead and move on. And I want them to print that card so badly. But anyway, let's move on to a card that I've actually already previewed on Twitter, and a lot of you told me you were really into this thing. Here's Tribute to the Allied right here. Just 1 and a white for a legendary artifact, but the legendary rule is not actually going to apply too much because this permanent can't leave the battlefield unless it's destroyed. Sort of a pseudo-indestructible, kind of the exact opposite of indestructible. We'll get back to that. But players can't cast spells from anywhere other than their hands. Yes, that also applies in Commander, but of course, conveniently, somebody's just going to destroy the artifact, because you can do that. But anyway, there's also a bit where players can't search their libraries for land cards. So again, another way to sort of hit these ramp decks that get to Ugin on turn 5 that are probably still going to be like played important decks in the format even once Nissa is gone. There's still going to be stuff like Cultivate. Euro's still around. There's probably going to be even more ramp cards in the format because this is Zendikar we're going into, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was a potent ramp spell. And stuff like this could really help to keep it down. Of course, in Commander, this keeps people from playing Commanders, but again, I think that most Commander players play spells that can take this thing out at some point. But most importantly, you can't bounce it, so you can't Brazen Borrower it. And while it's on the battlefield, you also can't play Brazen Borrower from Exile, or Bone Crusher Giant, or Lovestruck Beast, or Fae of Wishes. You see where I'm going with this? Not only does this nerf the ramp decks that are almost certain to be a thing in the upcoming standard, but it also nerfs the adventure decks that are, again, almost assuredly going to be top tier meta decks in standard. So we need ways to fight both of those strategies, and I like this card, at least conceptually. But before we get into the cards that are really Zendikar in nature, and I guess that last one it had the word allied on it, so that's kind of some red meat to the base right there. But I do have like 2 more cards to talk about that are more just like cards I want to see that could be in any set before we get to the really Zendikar-y stuff. But next I want to talk about Squirrel. This card. Squirrel right here. Now, this I want to see some version of, just because we have to replace Barkhide Troll. We also have to replace Pelt Collector. This isn't a 1-drop, and I end of the day, I just felt it, I've already made like a bunch of 1-drops for this video, so I wanted to make a 2-drop creature for this video, hence Squirrel, a sort of kind of sideways Strangleroot Geist in a way, kind of, but I wanted a green creature that not only had Trample, but also maybe had Haste. I was like, well, I want a green creature that has Trample, but I also want a green creature that has Haste, so why not just make a green creature that has both of those things? And this creature is pretty decent on the play, I imagine, but probably gets traded with a lot on the draw, and that's exactly the balance that I'm looking for. And by the way, Wizards, if you do print this card, it has to have exactly this art. By the way, if I could credit the artist, I would, but I think this is just from some like local news story, so I didn't really have an artist to credit. I think it was like Phoenix 10 or something, but anyway, I could not pass up making this the art for this card. But let's go ahead and move on and kind of clean up the stuff that's not very Zendikarian before we move on to the Zendikar stuff. And talk about low-key, maybe my favorite idea in this video, and that's Secrets of Communion. I love this card, really want it to exist. This does all kinds of things. Just 3 mana, 2 and a black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-black creature. And you can sacrifice a creature to gain 3 life. This does all kinds of things. First of all, it's Pretty decent against aggro decks, I guess, so long as you have enough creatures to sacrifice to it, because at least it removes something when it enters the battlefield. But this could also go in Doom Foretold decks, does something when it enters the battlefield. Pretty decent to sacrifice if you need an enchantment to do so, and it plays on curve well with Doom Foretold. But most importantly, a card like this goes really well with stuff like Griffin Eyrie. It goes really well with Veto, for instance. If you have a field full of dudes, sacrifice them all for free to this enchantment, and suddenly you're dealing like 9, 12, 15, 18 damage all in one shot. I think the Veto deck would really respect having a card like this around. It's also another free sacrifice engine, and we could see some decks wanting a card like that once certain things like Priest of Forgotten Gods rotate out of the format. So this card fills a whole lot of shoes and can go in a whole bunch of different little deck ideas, and I think that something like this is kind of important to print in the next format, even if it's not specifically this card. I like the idea of a 3-mana enchantment that does something when it enters the battlefield and aids like 4 different decks in the format. But hey, we made it, everybody. We're in the more Zendikar-flavored portion of the video. And let's start that part of the video by checking in on my favorite legend from all of Zendikar lore, hands down, and that's Drana. She's a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and she's also a decorated war veteran at this point who is very much admired by all the people of Zendikar. And I thought the best way to illustrate that in card form while still helping out another aggro deck. I do that a lot, don't I? Trust me, we'll talk about some not aggro stuff at some point in this video. But another card that helps out an aggro deck that I really like is Drana, Leader of Malakir. Just 2 black mana. Both mana are black. That helps out the devotion decks. That might be important. But it's a 2/2 legendary vampire ally that has other creatures you control get +1/+0. But it also has the Shade ability. Just 1 black mana for +1/+1 until end of turn. I wanted to illustrate how much the people of Zendikar admire her as a leader now. So she's an anthem at this point. She's more of a symbol than something that's actually able to fight on her own. But every now and again, if you pump enough mana into her, she can be the old Drana again. But again, for a cost. Now, know what you're thinking. No, I don't think this is too pushed. Turn your opponent plays this, and they're tapped down, you can shock it, or Grasp of Darkness it. You can always eliminate it or Heartless Act it. There are 100 removal pieces that take this thing out. So despite the fact that it's got a really busted pump ability and an Anthem effect on it for just 2 mana, no, I don't really think it's actually that broken. Not at all. There are a lot of controls on a card like this in the format. Honestly, I think the only thing I'd change about it, if I had to change something to nerf it a little bit, would be that the pump ability just gives it +1/+0 until end of turn. One last desperate lunge that gives her this huge threat of activation, but if she gets blocked, she's still going to die, right? Like, maybe that, but overall, I would, of course, be super happy if they printed exactly this, but they almost certainly never will. I challenge you. Do it, Wizards. Change everything about the set you've been working on for at least a year and a half, if not like 2 or 3 years. Like two weeks before it goes to press. Do that. Do it for me. But anyway, let's move on, because we got to talk a little bit about the Eldrazi. Now, there's not a whole lot of Eldrazi action in this video. Don't worry. I'm not bringing back the next 5 cards aren't Eldrazi. Don't worry. But we do have to talk a little bit about the destruction that the Eldrazi have surely wrought on Zendikar, and I think a few cards need to address that. We, of course, also have to address how we're going to replace some of the important lands in Standard right now, mostly shock lands, but we'll get to that in a second. Something that I keep seeing in the discourse online, and that a bunch of people have already told me in like Twitch chat, is that they'd like to see creature lands again, man lands, person lands, whatever you personally call them. People would like to see these back again, and so would I. But I don't want my dude lands to come into play tapped. I really don't like person lands that come into play. I know person lands is the one that everyone hates. That's why I'm using it. But I don't want my creature lands to come into play tapped. It triggers me a little bit, and I don't want... There's already so many comes into play tapped lands in the format. I don't want more. So I want a dude land that comes into play untapped. How do we do that? Well, my first idea was this dude right here, Creek Rapids. Now, this is just a land that taps for blue. Just taps for blue. Of course, you can also pump 1 and a blue into it and make it a 1/1 hexproof until end of turn. That's only because hexproof was the only blue ability I could think of that I wanted to put on the card. I didn't want to make it a flyer, because why would a river fly? That doesn't make sense. So instead, we did hexproof. And part of this card is, too, meant to illustrate Zendikar bouncing back, regrowing after the threat of the Eldrazi. Not only have its lands, revived in some way, almost entirely, but they're living at this point, right? So I kind of like that from a flavor perspective. And you could do one of these for each color. Like Thorny Brush, for instance. It's just a land that taps for green, but if you pump 1 and a green into it, it becomes a 1/1 with reach until end of turn. So I think if you did something like this, it'd be cute to give them all an ability suitable to their color, but just make them 1/1s, make it cost a couple of mana to make them creatures for the turn. And then eventually, they're probably better for blocking than they are for offense, but if you have to use them for offense in your control deck, you absolutely can. So I like this idea, but I also fear it might be slightly too pushed and maybe instant commander staples and stuff. So I don't know. Let me know how you feel about this one, because I'm on the fence. But moving on, we again have to address the fact that shocklands are rotating out of the format, and that's going to make mana really difficult for a lot of decks. Not just like 3-color mid-range control decks. And people seem to have that misconception. It's already hard enough in this format with shocklands to play 2-color aggro decks. It's really difficult some of the time to get that mana right. So, we really need to replace shocklands if a whole bunch of different kinds of decks are going to have any hope of functioning consistently and properly. So that said, an idea is to print some sort of untapped tri-land with a massive downside. I've seen a whole lot of ideas online about how to address this problem. I think instead of printing a whole new cycle of lands, 10 of them for each color combination or whatever you want to do, just print one land that is like a City of Brass, that is like a Mana Confluence, something like that. You can even just reprint Mana Confluence, but if I wanted to work my brain around a new way of doing this that's not just damage to you or life loss like a Mana Confluence or a Shockland, here's an idea. Here's Cradle of Rebirth right here. Now, obviously, it's just a land, and when it comes into play, you exile a card from your hand, but it taps for any color. And there's no downside after you've exiled the card from your hand. Of course, this makes it a terrible top deck. And it's going to be a really tough decision, even if you play this on turn 1, what you want to exile out of your hand, because you're effectively taking a mulligan in order to play this land. Is it still worth it to play the land? Yes. I think most of the time it is, especially in Standard where you don't have an alternative, like Mana Confluence or City of Brass. It's probably going to be worth this, and it's going to make for some very interesting decisions in the very early game that could affect the entire game. So, I'm not sure. I saw somebody on Twitter yesterday post a thing like, it tapped a land that taps for 2 colors, one of 2 colors. And when it comes into play, your opponent scries 2 or scries 3 or something. So I've seen a whole bunch of ideas on exactly how to balance new untapped dual lands or lands that can tap for any color. And I think there's a whole lot of rich design space to be explored. And this is just my take, but let me know how you feel about it. And let me know how you'd address the untapped land that can tap for multiple mana problem down there in the comments section, because it's an interesting topic. But let's keep going here with another card that I posted to Twitter, but I have since fixed because people correctly said this card was a little bit busted when I first posted it to Twitter. So one line of text I think fixed that all. That's Scars of the Behemoths right here. A Teamer enchantment. It costs 1 of each Teamer color. And lands you control enter the battlefield tapped. That's the new line on the card that wasn't there when I posted it to Twitter. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. And whenever you discard or sacrifice a land, you draw a card. Now you can pay a mana and discard or sacrifice a land to have Scars deal 2 damage to any target. By the way, that's another way that I've changed it since it was on Twitter. It originally said whenever you discard or sacrifice a land, but the activated ability only said sacrifice a land. Since I've balanced it a little bit, I've let the activated ability also allow you to discard the land. So anyway, I really like Seismic Assault. I love cards like Seismic Assault a whole lot. So I wanted to take on Seismic Assault that was maybe a little bit more powerful, but of course, maybe slightly harder to cast because it's in Teamer colors. But that said, I think you can push a card like Seismic Assault to be even better than it originally was in this day and age. This one draws cards. This one it functions effectively like, a Wayward Swordtooth or Dryad of the Elysian Grove that lets you drop extra lands every turn. So it does a green thing, drop extra lands, a blue thing, draws cards, and a red thing, pops for damage. Now, originally, it didn't have the line of text that made lands you control enter tapped, which means that you could play this on turn 3, play another land, hit your opponent for a whole bunch of damage, untap the next turn, and then dome them for like 12 or something. Can't do that anymore. But I will say, even when the card didn't say, lands ETB tap, you could like blast your opponent for 12 or whatever it is on turn 4, but then you'd be out of lands for the rest of the game. So good luck with that. But still, I felt like the card was fixable, so I went ahead and fixed it. I just wanted a card that illustrates again the damage that the Eldrazi have actually done to this plane. And I think a card like this does that well, right? Discarding and sacrificing lands and all that is perfectly illustrative of the damage the Eldrazi have done, but of course, it also kind of speaks to the rebuilding in terms of drawing a card and playing extra lands and all that. And by the way, earlier when I was talking about the explanation for this video's existence in the first place and why I do these videos, one of the things I forgot to say is that one of the best things about these videos is that you can go to the comments section and dunk on how broken my cards are. Do that. Tell me how stupid I am and I should never design cards for WotC because, oh my god, Dev, look at this stupid thing. But anyway, let's move on and address landfall. I made a landfall card here, but you will notice very shortly that I actually have not reintroduced a landfall mechanic into this set. But I do have a take on landfall. Here is Rebirth of the Waste right here, a 5-mana enchantment that costs 1 of each color. But whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, so landfall, you choose one of these things and you get something specific to each color, right? You can choose to gain 2 life, or draw a card, or destroy a non-black creature, or deal 2 damage to any target, or put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. So you got some options, and of course in like a Zeusa Lost but Seeking decks, this would be absolutely insane, or really any ramp deck you could think of. A card like this would be pretty crazy, and give you a reason to play 5-color ramp, not just like a boring Ugin deck. The deck would probably still play Ugin, right? But still, not just like a boring Ugin deck that tries to ramp to Ugin as quickly as possible, but a deck that actually has to try and play all 5 colors. I think this would be a great incentive to do that. Matter of fact, I don't think this card is pushed enough. I think you could easily say choose 2, but just being able to blow up a guy when you play a land is pretty intense. So I think the card is probably powerful enough on its own right now, but again, I wanted a card that symbolized not only the Eldrazi's destruction, but the rebirth of Zendikar from that destruction. But final card of the day, ladies and gentlemen, we got one more to talk about, and it's a card that's sort of an Eldrazi, but not really an Eldrazi. I told you there was going to be some Eldrazi in this video. It just wasn't going to be the whole video. I think that there are 2 ways you could go about putting an Eldrazi in this set, and I said an Eldrazi. I don't want to see more than 1, and 0 would be perfectly acceptable, but the professor from Tolarian Community College had the idea that if you're going to put an Eldrazi in this set, it should be like a 1/1 with Devoid that doesn't do anything else, and it costs like 3 mana. Just like one of the worst creatures ever to show, the dwindling presence of the Eldrazi. This is like the only Eldrazi left, and it sucks, right? I think that's a good idea. But another way you could go about that is a card like Forgotten Husk. For instance, this is just 1 mana for an artifact, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you put a time counter on it. And then once there are 10 or more time counters on it, you sacrifice it, and you make yourself an 8/8 Eldrazi creature token. Now, this, again, is indicative of the idea that not necessarily the Eldrazi have weakened, but we thought the Eldrazi were wiped out. But there's still a tiny seed of hope for the Eldrazi, and I think that would actually be a really interesting, like, dark implication that may allow us to revisit this plane again at some point. I don't know. I like the idea behind the card. Again, I'm totally vibing with Professor on the whole maybe just 1 Eldrazi card thing, and maybe it needs to be super weak. So I like that idea, but I also like the idea of, oh my goodness, we haven't wiped out the threat for, entirely, and the threat is very real for that matter. But of course, now it's your turn. You get a turn, and I read your comments. Go to the comments section. Let me know what cards of your own creation you'd like to see in the Zendikar set. And, remember to like, share, subscribe, all that, because actual spoiler season with real cards that are actually going to be in the set, it's coming up in like 2 weeks or less at this point. We don't have much time until spoiler season. So make sure you're subbed for the channel for our world-famous spoiler season content and coverage, analysis, reviews, all that stuff. And for deck techs and stuff like that. You can also watch me play Magic on Twitch. We have a lot of fun at twitch.tv/SBMTGDev. You can check out the Patreon at patreon.com/SBMTG. Links to all that stuff in the description if you can't remember it. And you can follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev too. if you want to do that. So if you want to know when I'm streaming, you do that. And of course, if you want to join the Patreon, $1 a month to vote on content. That's why I'm doing this video. This is by far like what the patrons wanted to see. Again, I don't know why this video is always so popular, but apparently people want to see it. So what are you going to do? Have fun, have fun creating it, which is exactly what I did. Hope you don't mind too much. Anyway, I think that's all for this one. I'm Dev from the Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.